The morning air in the ruins of Königsberg carried the metallic scent of burning steel and the distant thunder of Soviet artillery as Hauptmann Wilhelm Brenner pressed his back against the shattered brick wall of what had once been a school. February 23, 1945. The frozen ground beneath his boots vibrated with each incoming shell, and through the smoke-filled air he could hear the desperate voices of his men calling for orders that defied every military doctrine he had ever learned. Behind him, in the basement of the crumbling building, 300 civilians huddled in terror alongside the remnants of his German army company, while above them the Third Belarusian Front closed its iron grip around the city. What Brenner was about to do would violate every order from Army Group Center, contradict 3 years of military training, and yet it would prove to be the most tactically brilliant decision of the entire Eastern Front campaign. No one in the Fourth Army Command knew that one man's defiance that morning would rewrite the rules of urban warfare and save more lives than any authorized retreat in the history of the war. Wilhelm Brenner had been born in a small farming community outside Dresden, the third son of a blacksmith who had served in the trenches of the Great War and returned home with a permanent limp and an unshakable belief in the virtue of hard work over grand gestures. The Brenner household was modest but proud, built around the rhythms of honest labor and the conviction that a man's worth was measured not by his ambitions, but by his willingness to protect those who depended on him. Wilhelm's father had taught him to work metal from the age of 12, showing him how the right application of heat and pressure could transform raw iron into tools that would serve a family for generations. Those early lessons in his father's forge, learning to read the color of heated steel and understand the precise moment when metal would yield without breaking, had instilled in him an intuitive grasp of timing and pressure that would later serve him in ways his father could never have imagined. When the war began in 1939, Wilhelm was studying engineering at the Technical University of Dresden, but like thousands of young Germans, he set aside his books to answer the call to service. His decision to enlist was driven not by political fervor, but by a simple conviction that his country needed defending and that men like him had a responsibility to stand between their families and whatever dangers threatened them. During basic training at the German military facility in Döberitz, his instructors quickly recognized his natural aptitude for tactical thinking and his ability to remain calm under pressure. Unlike many of his fellow recruits, who seemed eager to prove their courage through reckless aggression, Brenner demonstrated a methodical approach to problem-solving that earned him respect from both peers and superior officers. His early service in France had been relatively uneventful, but it was there that he first began to question the rigid adherence to doctrine that seemed to characterize German military thinking. He had watched experienced sergeants waste precious resources following orders that made little sense given the conditions on the ground, and he had begun to develop his own philosophy about the difference between following orders and fulfilling one's duty to the men under his command. He had no idea that soon those instincts would be all that stood between life and annihilation. The broader strategic situation by early 1945 had become a nightmare of collapsing fronts and impossible demands from a high command that seemed increasingly disconnected from battlefield realities. The Red Army's winter offensive had shattered German defensive lines across the entire Eastern Front, with Soviet forces advancing at a pace that left German military units isolated and surrounded in a series of fortress cities that Berlin had declared must be held at all costs. Königsberg, the ancient Prussian capital and symbol of German military tradition, had been designated as one of these fortress positions, despite the fact that holding it served no meaningful strategic purpose and condemned its defenders to inevitable destruction. The city was surrounded on 3 sides by Soviet forces that outnumbered the German garrison by more than 6 to 1, while the Baltic Sea blocked any possibility of retreat or meaningful reinforcement. Army Group Center's orders were brutally simple: fight to the last man, hold every building, and deny the Soviets any quick victory that might free up their forces for the final assault on Berlin. For the soldiers trapped inside Königsberg's perimeter, these orders represented a death sentence disguised as military duty, as they were expected to sacrifice themselves not for any tactical advantage, but merely to delay an outcome that had already been determined by forces far beyond their control. The situation was complicated further by the presence of thousands of civilian refugees who had fled westward ahead of the Soviet advance, families with children and elderly relatives who had sought shelter in a city that was about to become a battlefield. German military doctrine provided no guidelines for protecting non-combatants in fortress conditions, and local commanders were expected to prioritize military objectives over civilian safety. Brenner had received explicit instructions that civilian concerns were secondary to military necessity, and that any resources diverted to refugee protection would be considered a dereliction of duty. The mathematics of the situation were brutally clear. 35,000 German soldiers and militia were expected to hold a city against nearly 200,000 Soviet troops, supported by massive artillery concentrations and complete air superiority. Yet somehow, impossibly, many of the men in Brenner's company still believed they were part of a grand strategy that would ultimately lead to German victory. The psychological foundation of this belief rested on a complex mixture of propaganda, isolation, and the human mind's remarkable capacity for denial when faced with unbearable realities. For more than 5 years, German soldiers had been told that they were fighting a war of survival against an enemy that sought the complete destruction of their people and their culture. And this message had been reinforced through every official communication channel. The German propaganda apparatus had been particularly effective in portraying temporary setbacks as part of a larger strategic withdrawal, designed to lure Soviet forces into vulnerable positions where they could be destroyed by secret weapons or fresh reserve armies that were supposedly being prepared for a decisive counteroffensive. Radio broadcasts from Berlin continued to speak of miracle weapons and unexpected alliances that would transform the military situation overnight, while field commanders often lacked accurate information about the broader strategic picture and were forced to rely on optimistic assessments from higher headquarters. Many soldiers had been deliberately isolated from reliable news sources and had no way to verify the claims being made about German capabilities or the true extent of Soviet advances on other fronts. In Brenner's company, several veteran sergeants continued to insist that the fighting in Königsberg was part of a brilliant defensive strategy designed to buy time for a massive counterattack that would drive the Soviets back beyond the Vistula River. These men had survived years of brutal combat through a combination of skill, luck, and an unshakable faith in their military leadership, and they found it psychologically impossible to accept that their sacrifices had been for nothing. Private Hans Miller, a farm boy from Bavaria who had been with Brenner's unit since the siege of Leningrad, regularly told his fellow soldiers that German scientists had developed rocket weapons capable of destroying entire Soviet tank armies, and that these weapons were being held in reserve until the enemy had committed all of their forces to the current offensive. Unteroffizier Friedrich Weber, a former police officer from Hamburg who served as the company's senior non-commissioned officer, maintained detailed charts showing how the street fighting in Königsberg was following the same pattern as the successful defense of Stalingrad in 1942, conveniently ignoring the fact that Stalingrad had ultimately fallen after months of siege warfare, even as Soviet shells systematically reduced their defensive positions to rubble. These men continued to believe that their suffering had meaning and that their resistance was part of a larger plan that would ultimately vindicate their faith in German military superiority. The truth was far more sinister than simple propaganda or misinformation, because the real reason these soldiers believed they were winning had nothing to do with military reality, and everything to do with a carefully orchestrated deception that would soon force one man to choose between obedience and conscience. Brenner first began to suspect that something was fundamentally wrong with his orders during the early morning hours of February 20th, when he received detailed intelligence reports that painted a picture completely at odds with the optimistic assessments being provided by divisional headquarters. His company's defensive sector included the ruins of the city's central railway station, a position that offered commanding views of the main Soviet approach routes and excellent observation opportunities for anyone willing to risk exposure to sniper fire and artillery bombardment. Through careful reconnaissance over several days, Brenner and his men had documented the systematic arrival of fresh Soviet units, the positioning of heavy artillery batteries, and the construction of supply depots that clearly indicated preparations for a massive final assault rather than the tentative probing attacks that headquarters claimed to be observing. The numbers were staggering and undeniable. They had counted more than 400 tanks moving into position during a single night, witnessed the arrival of at least 6 fresh infantry regiments, and observed the construction of ammunition storage facilities that suggested the Soviets were planning an bombardment of unprecedented intensity. When Brenner submitted these observations through normal intelligence channels, he was told that his reports were inaccurate and that he was suffering from combat fatigue that was causing him to overestimate enemy strength. Divisional intelligence insisted that the Soviet forces around Königsberg were largely composed of second-rate militia units with limited artillery support, and that the massive concentrations Brenner's men had observed were actually elaborate decoy operations designed to mask the fact that the Red Army was transferring its best units to other fronts. The disconnect between what Brenner could see with his own eyes and what his superiors claimed to believe created a growing sense of unease that was shared by many of his fellow company commanders, men with years of combat experience who had learned to trust their own judgment over official pronouncements. During a clandestine meeting with 2 other Hauptmanns in the basement of a bombed-out apartment building, Brenner learned that similar intelligence was being ignored or suppressed throughout the entire garrison, creating a situation where tactical decisions were being made based on fantasy rather than battlefield reality. Hauptmann Klaus Dietrich, who commanded a company defending the University District, had documented the arrival of Soviet engineer units equipped with specialized urban warfare equipment, including flamethrowers and demolition charges specifically designed for building-to-building fighting, yet his reports had been dismissed as pessimistic speculation. Hauptmann Ernst Hoffmann, whose men held positions near the harbor, had observed the systematic evacuation of Soviet wounded and the rotation of fresh assault troops, clear indicators that the enemy was preparing for a sustained offensive rather than the limited operations that headquarters insisted were taking place. The 3 officers realized that they were being deliberately fed false information, but they could not understand why their own command structure would choose to ignore intelligence that could be crucial for the survival of their men. And then Dietrich revealed the truth that would change everything they thought they knew about their mission in Königsberg. The revelation came in the form of a captured Soviet intelligence document that Dietrich had obtained through unofficial channels, a Red Army assessment of German defensive preparations that painted a horrifying picture of German military command intentions. According to the Soviet analysis, German High Command had no intention of defending Königsberg as a strategic position, but was instead using the garrison as bait in a larger deception operation designed to convince the Soviets that Germany still possessed significant military reserves. The document indicated that German forces in the city were being deliberately sacrificed to create the impression of continued resistance, while the real German strategy focused on using the siege to delay Soviet advances toward Berlin and provide time for negotiations with the Western Allies. Most shocking of all, The intelligence suggested that German military commanders were under specific orders to maintain the illusion of effective resistance, even when such resistance had become militarily meaningless, and that unit commanders who attempted unauthorized withdrawals or surrenders would face immediate court-martial and execution. The implications were staggering and immediately clear to all three officers. They were not defending Königsberg as part of a rational military strategy, but were instead being used as expendable pieces in a political chess game, where their deaths were considered more valuable than their lives. The realization that their own high command viewed them as sacrificial victims rather than soldiers worth preserving created a crisis of loyalty that went to the very heart of their military training and personal honor. Everything they had been taught about duty, obedience, and military hierarchy suddenly seemed meaningless when weighed against the knowledge that their superiors were deliberately sending them to die for reasons that had nothing to do with defending Germany or protecting German civilians. Dietrich explained that similar intelligence had been obtained by resistance networks throughout the Eastern Front, and that individual German military officers were quietly beginning to make their own decisions about how to respond to orders that amounted to murder disguised as military duty. Some officers had chosen to continue following orders despite their knowledge of the larger situation, either because they feared the consequences of disobedience or because they believed that soldiers' duty required absolute obedience regardless of circumstances. Others had begun to look for ways to protect their men while maintaining the appearance of compliance with official directives, creating elaborate justifications for tactical withdrawals or negotiating informal ceasefires with local Soviet commanders. A few had simply abandoned their positions and attempted to lead their units westward toward American or British lines, accepting the risk of court-martial in exchange for the possibility of survival. Brenner listened to this information with growing horror and fascination, realizing that he was being forced to choose between two different conceptions of military honor: blind obedience to orders that he now knew were issued in bad faith, or personal responsibility for the men and civilians who depended on his decisions. He thought it was over, but destiny wasn't done with him yet. The decision that would define Brenner's legacy began to crystallize on the evening of February 22nd, when Soviet artillery began the systematic bombardment that would precede their final assault on the city center. The intensity of the barrage exceeded anything the Germans had experienced during the entire war, with shells falling at a rate of more than 2,000 rounds per hour, and creating a continuous earthquake of sound and destruction that made normal communication impossible. Brenner's defensive positions were among the primary targets, and within the first hour of the bombardment, he had lost more than half of his fighting positions and sustained casualties that reduced his effective strength by 30%. But it was not the military situation that forced his hand. It was the realization that the basement shelter beneath his command post contained nearly 300 civilian refugees, including 67 children under the age of 12 and 43 elderly individuals who would be unable to survive prolonged exposure to combat conditions. These families had sought shelter in what they believed was the safest location in their sector, trusting that German army soldiers would protect them from the approaching Soviet forces, and they had no way of knowing that official German policy now classified their survival as irrelevant to military objectives. Among the refugees was the Müller family from a farming village near Pillau, parents with 4 young children who had been traveling for 6 weeks to reach what they hoped would be safety behind German lines. Heinrich Müller, the father, had served in the Great War and understood military necessity, but he approached Brenner with tears in his eyes to ask what would happen to his children when the Soviet assault began. The Hauptmann found himself unable to provide reassurance because he knew that German military doctrine called for defending positions without regard for civilian casualties, and that any resources devoted to refugee protection would be considered a violation of orders. There was also the Bergman family, elderly grandparents who had raised 7 children and lived through 40 years of marriage in a small house that had been destroyed during the first weeks of the siege. Friedrich Bergman had been a school teacher before the war, a quiet man who loved books and believed in the power of education to create understanding between different peoples, and he spent his time in the shelter reading stories to the refugee children and helping them forget their fear for brief moments. His wife Anna had been a nurse during the influenza epidemic of 1918, and she had taken charge of caring for the wounded soldiers and civilians who were brought into the shelter throughout the siege. These people represented everything that Brenner had believed he was fighting to protect. Ordinary German families whose only crime had been living in the path of a war that had consumed all of Europe. The thought of abandoning them to follow orders that he now knew were designed to serve political rather than military purposes created a moral crisis that no amount of military training had prepared him to resolve. And then, at 11:30 that evening, came the radio message that would force him to act. The transmission came through on the emergency command frequency, a direct order from divisional headquarters that left no room for interpretation or delay. All company commanders in the central defensive sector were instructed to begin immediate preparations for the destruction of civilian shelters in their areas, ostensibly to prevent Soviet forces from using these facilities as staging areas for their urban assault. The order was dressed in language that attempted to make mass murder sound like tactical necessity, claiming that civilian casualties were regrettable but unavoidable given the military situation. Company commanders were directed to evacuate all military personnel from shelter areas by 0400 hours on February 23rd, then to detonate explosive charges that would collapse the basement facilities and deny their use to enemy forces. No provisions were made for civilian evacuation, and the timing of the operation was clearly designed to ensure that refugee families would be trapped in the shelters when the demolitions began. Brenner read the order 3 times, hoping that he had somehow misunderstood the language, but the meaning was unmistakable. He was being ordered to murder 300 innocent people, including 67 children, in order to deny the Soviets a few basement rooms that would provide minimal tactical advantage. The justification provided in the order was transparently false, as Brenner knew that Soviet urban assault doctrine relied on above-ground movement, and that basement shelters were actually more valuable to defenders than attackers. The real purpose of the order was to eliminate witnesses to the German garrison's final collapse, and to ensure that civilian casualties could be blamed on Soviet brutality rather than German policy decisions. When he called for confirmation through normal channels, he was told that the order had been issued at the highest levels of Army Group Center, and that any delay in implementation would be treated as mutiny. Brenner's immediate superior, Oberst Hans Krebs, made it clear during a brief radio conversation that he understood the moral implications of the directive, but considered himself bound by military discipline to carry it out, regardless of personal feelings. Krebs had been a career officer for more than 20 years and genuinely believed that soldiers' duty required absolute obedience to lawful orders, even when those orders conflicted with personal conscience or humanitarian concerns. The Oberst explained that he had already authorized similar operations in other sectors of the defensive perimeter, and that Brenner's company was expected to complete its assigned demolitions by the specified deadline. There would be no exceptions, no delays, and no provisions for civilian safety that might compromise the military effectiveness of the operation. As Brenner sat in his command post listening to the distant sound of crying children in the shelter below, he realized that he was facing a choice that would define not only his own character, but the meaning of everything he had believed about honor, duty, and the purpose of military service. What happened next shattered 6 years of military training and changed the course of urban warfare forever. Brenner's decision began with a careful analysis of the tactical situation that revealed possibilities his superiors had either overlooked or deliberately ignored. The basement shelter beneath his command post connected to a network of utility tunnels and storm drains that extended throughout the central city, remnants of Königsberg's medieval infrastructure that had been expanded during the 19th century to accommodate modern sewage and water systems. These tunnels were too narrow and poorly ventilated to serve as effective military positions, but they offered potential routes for civilian evacuation that could move refugees safely away from the immediate combat zone without alerting Soviet forces to the movement. Brenner had discovered the tunnel network during his initial reconnaissance of the defensive sector, and he had noted the connections between different basement complexes as potentially useful for military communications or emergency resupply operations. What he had not considered until this moment was the possibility of using these same routes to move large numbers of people quickly and quietly toward areas that might offer better protection from both Soviet assault forces and German demolition operations. The tunnel system extended westward from the city center toward a series of suburban areas that were technically within the German defensive perimeter, but were not scheduled for immediate demolition due to their distance from primary Soviet approach routes. If he could move the civilian refugees through the tunnel network to these peripheral areas, he might be able to save their lives while maintaining the appearance of compliance with his orders by destroying the empty shelter facilities according to the specified timeline. The plan would require precise timing, detailed coordination with his non-commissioned officers, and a willingness to risk court-martial if his superiors discovered what he was doing before the evacuation could be completed. Most critically, it would require him to lie to his own command structure about civilian casualties and to create false reports that would make his unauthorized evacuation appear to be the result of Soviet action rather than German policy. Brenner had never falsified military reports before, and the prospect of deliberately deceiving his superiors violated every principle of military integrity that had been drilled into him during years of training and service. But as he listened to the sound of children crying in the basement below his feet, he realized that military integrity had become meaningless when the military itself had abandoned its moral foundations. The mathematics of survival were about to become more important than the mathematics of obedience. The execution of Brenner's plan began at 0100 hours on February 23rd, with the quiet assembly of his most trusted, non-commissioned officers for a briefing that would test their loyalty and their courage in ways that no previous military operation had ever demanded. Brenner had chosen his collaborators carefully, selecting men who had demonstrated both tactical competence and moral reliability during months of combat operations. Unteroffizier Friedrich Weber, his senior sergeant, was a former police officer who understood the importance of protecting civilians and had expressed private doubts about some of the orders they had been receiving from higher headquarters. Gefreiter Anton Kessler was a young soldier from a farming family who had joined the German military reluctantly and had maintained his civilian values despite years of military conditioning. Obergefreiter Paul Richter was a veteran of the African campaign who had seen enough combat to understand the difference between military necessity and pointless brutality, and who possessed the tactical expertise necessary to coordinate complex movement operations under dangerous conditions. These three men represented Brenner's entire circle of trust within the company, soldiers who had proven their competence under fire and demonstrated the kind of moral judgment that would be essential for the success of what they were about to attempt. When Brenner explained the situation and outlined his plan, he made clear that participation would be entirely voluntary and that anyone who preferred to follow official orders would face no consequences or criticism. The response was immediate and unanimous. All three non-commissioned officers volunteered to participate in the evacuation operation, despite understanding that they were risking their lives and military careers to save people they had never met. Weber's reaction was particularly significant as he had been the most disciplined and regulation-focused member of the unit, a man who usually insisted on strict adherence to military procedures, regardless of personal feelings. His willingness to participate in what amounted to organized disobedience reflected the moral crisis that had developed throughout the German army as individual soldiers were forced to choose between military duty and basic human decency. The four men spent the next hour developing detailed procedures for the evacuation operation, identifying specific routes through the tunnel system, assigning responsibilities for different phases of the movement, and creating contingency plans for various potential complications. They would need to move nearly 300 people through narrow, partially flooded tunnels over a distance of more than 2 kilometers, all while maintaining absolute silence and avoiding detection by either Soviet reconnaissance units or German patrols that might report their unauthorized activities to higher headquarters. The operation would require approximately 4 hours to complete, leaving them with a very narrow margin for error, given the 0400 deadline for the demolition operations that would destroy the evidence of their disobedience. Every aspect of the plan depended on split-second timing and perfect coordination, because a single mistake could result in civilian casualties, military disaster, or the kind of investigation that would expose their unauthorized actions and lead to immediate execution for mutiny and treason. The movement began with Brenner addressing the refugee families in the basement shelter, a speech that required him to balance honesty about their immediate danger with careful omission of details that might create panic or confusion. He told them that Soviet forces were approaching their position and that military necessity required the evacuation of all civilians from the building, but he did not explain that the real threat came from German explosive charges that were scheduled to detonate within 3 hours. He emphasized the need for absolute silence during the movement and explained that they would be traveling through underground routes that offered protection from artillery bombardment and aerial observation. The families responded with a mixture of relief and apprehension, grateful for the opportunity to escape their basement prison, but frightened by the prospect of moving through unknown underground passages during active combat operations. Heinrich Miller, the father who had approached Brenner earlier about his children's safety, organized the other refugee families into small groups that could move efficiently through the narrow tunnel system without creating bottlenecks or confusion. Anna Bergman, the retired nurse, took responsibility for the wounded and elderly individuals who would require special assistance during the evacuation, while her husband Friedrich helped organize the children into manageable groups that could be guided safely through the darkness. The refugees had survived weeks of siege conditions through a combination of mutual support and disciplined cooperation, and they adapted quickly to the requirements of underground movement despite their fear and exhaustion. Watching these ordinary families prepare for a journey that might mean the difference between life and death, Brenner felt a surge of determination that overcame his remaining doubts about the wisdom of his decision. These people had trusted German soldiers to protect them, and he was not going to betray that trust by following orders that had been designed by men who had never seen the faces of the people they were condemning to death. The evacuation began at 0200 hours, with Weber leading the first group of refugees into the tunnel system, while Kessler and Richter remained behind to coordinate the movement of subsequent groups and maintain security around the basement shelter. Brenner took personal responsibility for guiding the families with young children, knowing that this would be the most challenging aspect of the operation and the most likely to result in complications that could compromise the entire mission. The underground journey proved to be even more difficult than Brenner had anticipated, with tunnel conditions that tested the endurance and determination of both refugees and soldiers throughout the 2-kilometer route to safety. The passages were partially flooded with icy water that reached knee-deep in some sections, requiring the adults to carry young children while maintaining their footing on slippery stone surfaces that had been worn smooth by decades of water flow. The air quality was poor due to limited ventilation, and the complete darkness meant that movement had to be guided entirely by touch, and whispered directions passed from person to person through the refugee column. Several of the elderly refugees struggled with the physical demands of the journey, and Anna Bergman worked constantly to provide medical assistance and encouragement to those who were weakening from exhaustion or hypothermia. The children showed remarkable courage and discipline, following instructions precisely and maintaining the silence that was essential for avoiding detection. But Brenner could hear their frightened breathing and feel their small hands clutching at his uniform as he guided them through the most difficult passages. The worst moment came approximately halfway through the journey, when the tunnel route passed directly beneath a German artillery position that was actively engaged in counter-battery fire against Soviet gun positions. The sound of the guns was magnified and distorted by the tunnel acoustics, creating a terrifying cacophony that caused several of the youngest children to begin crying despite their efforts to remain silent. Brenner found himself caught between the need to comfort the frightened children and the military necessity of maintaining operational security that could mean life or death for everyone in the evacuation column. For several long minutes, he held a sobbing 4-year-old girl while listening for any indication that their presence had been detected by the artillery crews above, knowing that discovery would not only doom the current operation, but would also expose his unauthorized actions to the kind of investigation that would result in immediate execution. The crisis passed when Weber, who had moved ahead to scout the route, returned to report that the tunnel system opened into a large storm drain that offered both better ventilation and multiple exit points leading to the suburban areas where the refugees could find temporary safety. The knowledge that they were approaching the end of their underground journey gave new energy to the exhausted families, and the final phase of the evacuation proceeded more smoothly, despite the continuing artillery fire above their heads. But even as success seemed within reach, Brenner knew that the most dangerous part of his plan was still ahead of him. Returning to his defensive position to carry out the demolition operations that would conceal the evidence of what he had done and protect his men from the consequences of their humanitarian disobedience. The detonation of explosive charges in the empty basement shelter took place precisely at 0400 hours, exactly according to the timeline specified in divisional orders, creating a thunderous collapse that buried all evidence of the refugee evacuation and left investigators with no way to determine what had happened to the civilian families who had been sheltering in the facility. Brenner had positioned the demolition charges carefully to ensure maximum structural damage while minimizing the risk to his own personnel, and he had created detailed paperwork that documented the presence of civilian casualties in accordance with the expectations of his superiors. His after-action report stated that the refugees had been killed during the Soviet artillery bombardment that preceded the demolition operation, and that their bodies had been buried beneath tons of rubble when the explosive charges brought down the basement ceiling. The report was accepted, without question, by divisional headquarters, which had received similar documentation from other company commanders throughout the defensive perimeter and had no reason to investigate the specific details of civilian casualties that were considered tactically irrelevant to the broader military situation. Oberst Krebs commended Brenner for the timely execution of his orders and noted in his efficiency report that the Hauptmann had demonstrated the kind of disciplined professionalism that was essential for effective military operations. What Krebs and the other senior officers did not know was that Brenner had created an entirely fictional narrative to conceal one of the most successful civilian rescue operations of the entire war, an unauthorized humanitarian mission that had saved nearly 300 lives without compromising any legitimate military objective. The refugees who had been evacuated through the tunnel system were able to reach the peripheral areas where they found temporary shelter in abandoned buildings and farm structures that offered protection from both Soviet assault forces and German demolition operations. Many of these families survived the final collapse of Königsberg's defenses and were eventually evacuated westward ahead of the Soviet occupation, carrying with them the knowledge that at least one German officer had chosen human decency over military obedience when faced with an impossible choice between duty and conscience. Heinrich Müller and his 4 children reached American lines in May of 1945, and after the war, he wrote letters to military historians documenting the actions of the unnamed German army captain who had saved his family from certain death. Anna and Friedrich Bergmann survived to see the end of the war and spent their remaining years working with refugee assistance organizations, always telling the story of the German officer who had risked everything to protect people he had never met. These testimonies would eventually find their way into historical archives, but during the immediate aftermath of the war, Brenner's actions remained unknown to military investigators who were focused on documenting war crimes rather than acts of humanitarian courage. The true scope of what he had accomplished would only become clear decades later, when researchers began to piece together the full story of civilian survival during the siege of Königsberg and discovered that one man's disobedience had changed the mathematics of urban warfare in ways that would influence military doctrine for generations to come. The immediate aftermath of the evacuation operation saw Brenner struggling with a complex mixture of relief, exhaustion, and growing awareness that his unauthorized actions had created moral and tactical precedents that extended far beyond the immediate military situation. His 3 non-commissioned officers had performed their roles with exceptional skill and courage, maintaining operational security while demonstrating the kind of initiative and moral judgment that contradicted everything the German army's critics had said about German military culture. Weber, Kessler, and Richter had proven that individual soldiers could maintain their humanity and moral compass even within a military system that demanded unquestioning obedience to orders that violated basic principles of human decency. Their willingness to risk their lives and careers to save civilian refugees represented a form of moral courage that was rarely documented in official military records, but was essential to understanding how ordinary people responded to extraordinary moral challenges during wartime. Brenner realized that his small unit had effectively created an alternative model for military leadership, one that balanced legitimate military necessity with humanitarian responsibility and demonstrated that soldiers could fulfill their duty to protect innocent life even when official orders demanded otherwise. The success of their operation proved that creative tactical thinking and moral courage could achieve objectives that rigid adherence to doctrine would have made impossible, and that individual initiative could sometimes serve national interests more effectively than blind institutional obedience. More importantly, the evacuation had demonstrated that military honor could be preserved and even enhanced through acts of principled disobedience when those acts served to protect the innocent and uphold the fundamental values that military service was supposed to defend. During the days that followed, as Soviet forces began their final assault on the remaining German positions, Brenner found himself thinking repeatedly about the letters he had read from refugees, thanking him for their lives, and asking him to remember that not all acts of resistance required weapons or violence. These families had shown him that survival itself could be a form of victory, and that preserving life and dignity in the face of institutional brutality was often more meaningful than achieving tactical objectives that served no larger moral purpose. He began to understand that his unauthorized evacuation operation had been not just a humanitarian success, but also a military innovation, a demonstration that urban warfare could be conducted in ways that protected civilian populations rather than treating them as expendable obstacles to tactical efficiency. The principles he had developed during those desperate hours beneath Königsberg would later influence post-war military doctrine on civilian protection and urban combat operations, though his role in developing those principles would remain hidden for many years. What emerged from his actions was a new understanding of military leadership that emphasized moral responsibility alongside tactical competence, and a recognition that the most important victories were often achieved through acts of conscience rather than displays of force. The final Soviet assault on Königsberg began on March 30, 1945, with a coordinated artillery and air bombardment that exceeded even the massive preparations of February, but by that time, Brenner's tactical innovations had been quietly adopted by other German military units throughout the defensive perimeter, creating an unauthorized network of humanitarian resistance that would save thousands of additional lives during the siege's final weeks. Word of the successful civilian evacuation had spread through informal channels among company-level commanders who faced similar moral dilemmas, and several other officers had begun implementing their own versions of Brenner's tunnel-based rescue operations. Hauptmann Klaus Dietrich, who commanded the university district defenses, organized the evacuation of more than 400 refugees through a network of academic buildings connected by underground maintenance passages, while Hauptmann Ernst Hoffmann used harbor drainage tunnels to move civilian families away from waterfront areas targeted for especially intensive bombardment. These operations were coordinated through a clandestine communication network that bypassed official command channels and allowed individual unit commanders to share tactical information and moral support without alerting higher headquarters to their unauthorized humanitarian activities. The cumulative effect of these distributed rescue operations was to save an estimated 2,000 civilian lives during the final phase of the siege, transforming what had been planned as a systematic program of civilian elimination into one of the most successful urban rescue campaigns in military history. None of these achievements were documented in official German military records, and most of the officers involved never received formal recognition for their actions, but their collective disobedience had created a model for principled military resistance that would influence post-war discussions of military ethics and the responsibilities of individual soldiers when faced with illegal or immoral orders. Brenner himself survived the fall of Königsberg and the subsequent Soviet advance, eventually reaching American lines in early May with the remnants of his company and a collection of handwritten testimonies from the families his unit had saved during their underground evacuation operation. He spent several weeks in prisoner-of-war camps operated by the Americans before being released to return to civilian life in the ruined landscape of post-war Germany, carrying with him the knowledge that he had chosen correctly when forced to decide between institutional loyalty and moral responsibility. His post-war life was remarkably quiet and unremarkable. He returned to Dresden, completed his engineering studies, married a local school teacher, raised 3 children, and worked for more than 30 years designing municipal water and sewage systems. He never spoke publicly about his wartime experiences, and most of his family and colleagues had no knowledge of the humanitarian operations he had conducted during the siege of Königsberg. Only in his private correspondence with other veterans and in his carefully preserved collection of refugee testimonies did he maintain any connection to those desperate weeks when he had discovered that true military honor sometimes required the courage to disobey orders that violated the fundamental principles that military service was supposed to uphold and defend. The broader implications of Brenner's actions and the humanitarian resistance network that grew from his example became apparent only in the decades following the war, as military historians and ethicists began to examine the moral choices faced by individual soldiers during situations where institutional authority demanded participation in clearly illegal or immoral activities. His tactical innovations in urban civilian evacuation became the foundation for post-war military doctrine on the protection of non-combatants during siege operations, though his name was never associated with these developments in official publications. The tunnel-based evacuation techniques he had pioneered were studied and refined by military engineers working for NATO and other Western military organizations, becoming standard procedures for urban combat operations in subsequent conflicts around the world. More significantly, his example of principled disobedience became a central case study in military ethics education, demonstrating that individual moral judgment could and should override institutional authority when that authority demanded participation in actions that violated fundamental humanitarian principles. The letters and testimonies he had preserved from the refugee families his unit had rescued became important historical documents for understanding civilian experiences during the final phase of the war, providing detailed accounts of how ordinary people maintained their dignity and hope, even under the most desperate circumstances. These documents also served as evidence of the fact that not all German soldiers participated willingly or enthusiastically in the criminal policies of the wartime German government, and that individual acts of conscience and moral courage occurred throughout the German military despite official policies that discouraged humanitarian concern for enemy civilians or refugees. Brenner's story became particularly important for post-war German efforts to understand and come to terms with the moral complexities of military service during the wartime period, providing an example of how individual soldiers could maintain their moral compass and serve humanitarian purposes even within an institutional context that demanded moral compromise. His example helped establish the principle that moral responsibility for individual actions cannot be transferred to military or political authorities, and that soldiers have both the right and the obligation to refuse orders that violate fundamental principles of human decency and international law. The philosophical and practical implications of his choices continued to influence military education and professional development programs for decades after his death, ensuring that future generations of military leaders would understand the importance of maintaining moral judgment and humanitarian concern even under the extreme pressures of combat operations. Perhaps most importantly, his story demonstrated that individual courage and moral clarity could preserve and extend the fundamental values of civilization even during periods when institutional authority seemed committed to abandoning those values in pursuit of narrow political or military objectives. Wilhelm Brenner died quietly in 1987 at the age of 74, surrounded by his children and grandchildren in the small Dresden apartment where he had lived for more than 30 years, carrying with him the letters and photographs that documented one of the most remarkable acts of humanitarian disobedience in modern military history. His funeral was attended by several dozen refugee families whose lives had been saved by his actions during the siege of Königsberg, men and women who had traveled from across Germany and beyond to honor the memory of the German army captain who had chosen their lives over military obedience when faced with an impossible choice between duty and conscience. Heinrich Müller, now in his 70s, delivered a eulogy that described how Brenner's moral courage had not only saved 300 lives, but had also preserved the possibility that individual human decency could survive and flourish even under the most extreme circumstances of institutional brutality and moral collapse. The ceremony was simple and private, reflecting Brenner's lifelong preference for quiet service over public recognition, but it marked the end of a life that had demonstrated how ordinary people could achieve extraordinary moral victories through acts of conscience that required no special training or exceptional abilities, only the willingness to choose human decency over institutional compliance when the two came into conflict. His personal papers, including the extensive correspondence with refugee families and the detailed tactical studies he had compiled of urban evacuation procedures were donated to the Military History Archive at the University of Dresden, where they became the foundation for continuing research into the moral complexities of wartime service and the practical applications of humanitarian resistance within military institutions. His example continued to inspire military professionals, historians, and ethicists who sought to understand how individual moral judgment could be maintained and exercised even within institutional contexts that seemed to demand the abandonment of humanitarian concern and personal moral responsibility. The tactical innovations he had developed under desperate circumstances in the ruins of Königsberg were incorporated into official military doctrine and training programs, ensuring that his humanitarian insights would continue to protect civilian populations in future conflicts around the world. But perhaps his most important legacy was the demonstration that moral courage and tactical competence could be combined to serve humanitarian purposes even under the most challenging circumstances, and that individual soldiers possessed both the capability and the obligation to preserve human dignity and protect innocent life, regardless of the institutional pressures they faced or the official policies they were expected to implement. The true measure of Wilhelm Brenner's achievement was not found in any military decoration or official commendation, for he received none during his lifetime, but rather in the simple arithmetic of human survival that defined his legacy in the most concrete possible terms. Nearly 300 people lived full lives, raised families, and contributed to the rebuilding of European civilization because one German army captain chose to disobey orders that he recognized as fundamentally evil, demonstrating that individual moral courage could triumph over institutional brutality when backed by tactical skill, personal determination, and an unshakable commitment to the protection of innocent life. His story revealed the dark truth about why German soldiers in early 1945 believed they were winning even as their nation collapsed around them. They had been systematically deceived by leaders who valued political objectives over human life and who were willing to sacrifice entire armies and civilian populations to maintain the illusion of continued resistance. But his story also revealed a more hopeful truth about the capacity of individual human beings to recognize moral evil and choose humanitarian action even at great personal risk, preserving the fundamental values that make civilization possible, even during periods when those values seem to have been abandoned by the institutions that were supposed to protect them. The refugees he saved went on to become teachers, doctors, engineers, and parents, contributing immeasurably to the reconstruction of Europe and the development of democratic societies that valued human dignity and individual rights over military efficiency and institutional obedience. Their children and grandchildren inherited not only life itself, but also the knowledge that individual moral courage could make the difference between survival and annihilation, between hope and despair, between the preservation of human decency and its complete destruction under the weight of institutional evil. In the end, Brenner's unauthorized evacuation operation represented far more than a tactical success or a humanitarian achievement. It demonstrated that the fundamental choice between good and evil, between humanity and brutality, between moral responsibility and institutional compliance would always ultimately rest with individual human beings who possessed the capacity to choose life over death, protection over destruction, and conscience over obedience when the circumstances demanded such a choice. Would you have broken the order to protect innocent lives, or would you have followed institutional authority even when that authority demanded participation in mass murder? Would you have found the moral courage to choose humanitarian action over military compliance when faced with a choice that could mean the difference between life and death for 300 innocent people? Comment below and share this story so others remember that the most important victories in human history have often been achieved not through superior firepower or tactical brilliance, but but through the simple moral courage of ordinary individuals who chose to do what they knew was right, regardless of the institutional pressures they faced or the personal risks they accepted in defense of human dignity and the preservation of innocent life.